Nikita Khrushchev was one of the most powerful men of the 20th century. He led the Soviet Union through some of the tensest years of the Cold War, denounced Stalin before the world, and brought humanity to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But this video is not about Khrushchev the leader. This is about the children who lived in his shadow. Some built quiet careers in science, far from politics. Others were pulled into the media spotlight, navigating the dangerous intersection of family and power. Some died young, their lives cut short by war or illness, and one would eventually leave the Soviet Union altogether, becoming a bridge between two worlds. From birth to death, from privilege to exile, this is the complete story of what happened to Nikita Khrushchev's children. Yulia Khrushcheva was born in 1915 during the chaos of World War I. Her father, Nikita Khrushchev, was a young metal worker in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, exempt from military conscription due to his skilled trade. Her mother was Yefrosinya Pisareva, the daughter of a lift operator at the Ruchenkovo mine. The family lived in Yuzovka, later renamed Stalino, and eventually Donetsk. It was one of the most industrialized regions of the Russian Empire, a place of coal mines, workshops, and working-class struggle. Yulia entered a world on the edge of revolution. Yulia was 2 years old when the Russian Revolution transformed the political landscape. Her father became increasingly involved in workers' councils and strike actions. By 1918, he had joined the Bolsheviks and would soon become a political commissar in the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. These were years of deprivation and violence. The civil war between the Bolsheviks and the White Army tore through Ukraine. Food was scarce. Disease was rampant. Yulia's early childhood was marked by the absence of her father, who was away fighting, and the struggle of her mother to keep the family alive. In 1920, when Yulia was only 5 years old, her mother Yefrosinya died. The cause was typhus, compounded by hunger and exhaustion during the famine that followed the Civil War. Yulia and her younger brother Leonid, who was only 3, were suddenly motherless. Initially, the children were raised by their grandmother. Their father was consumed by his work in the Communist Party, rising through the ranks in the chaos of the early Soviet period. In 1922, Khrushchev briefly married a 17-year-old woman named Marusha, but she neglected her stepchildren, and Khrushchev's mother persuaded him to leave her. In 1923, Khrushchev began living with Nina Petrovna Kukharchuk, a teacher and Civil War veteran, though they would not officially register their marriage until decades later. Nina brought Yulia and Leonid into her household. Yulia, now 8 years old, gained a stepmother. Unlike many children who reject step-parents, Yulia accepted Nina Petrovna. She never called her mother, always addressing her formally as Nina Petrovna, but the relationship was warm. This was crucial, as Yulia's adolescence coincided with her father's rapid rise through the Communist Party hierarchy. By the late 1920s, Khrushchev was secretary of various party districts. The family moved to Moscow in 1929, where Khrushchev attended the Industrial Academy. Yulia was now a teenager living in the capital, watching her father transform from a provincial party official into a Moscow insider. These were also the years of Stalin's consolidation of power and the beginning of the Great Purges. The atmosphere was one of opportunity mixed with danger. Yulia witnessed firsthand the privileges that came with party connections, but also the paranoia and fear. Yulia initially dreamed of becoming an architect. She entered a specialized institute to pursue this goal. However, her health derailed these plans. She contracted tuberculosis, a common disease in the crowded, poorly ventilated buildings of Soviet cities. The treatment was long and difficult. She had to abandon her architectural studies. After recovering, she shifted her focus to chemistry, a field that would keep her away from the political spotlight. She completed her training and became a chemist, working in scientific institutions rather than in the political apparatus. This choice was deliberate. While her father was becoming one of the most powerful men in the Soviet Union, Yulia chose a path of relative obscurity. Yulia married Viktor Gonchar, who became the director of the Kiev Opera. It was a cultured, artistic household, far removed from the halls of the Kremlin. They built a life centered around music, sciences, and domestic routine. Unlike some children of Soviet leaders who leveraged their connections for personal advancement, Yulia maintained a low profile. She worked in her profession, raised her family, and avoided the dangerous game of Kremlin politics. When her father rose to leadership of the Soviet Union in the 1950s, Yulia did not use the position for visibility. She accompanied the family on the 1959 trip to the United States, but as a quiet presence, not a public figure. Yulia lived into the post-Soviet era. She died in 1981, a decade after her father's death in 1971, having outlived him by 10 years. Her legacy is that of a private life deliberately chosen. In a system where proximity to power often meant either exploitation of that power or destruction by it, Yulia found a middle path. She was close enough to understand the mechanisms of Soviet leadership, but distant enough to survive them. She was the eldest child of one of the most powerful men of the 20th century, yet she left almost no public record, and perhaps that was the point. Leonid Khrushchev was born on November 7, 1917, 3 days after the October Revolution. His birth coincided with the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd. It was a moment of historical rupture, and Leonid entered a world in flames. Like his sister Yulia, he was the child of Nikita Khrushchev and Yefrosinia Pisareva. His early life was defined by the same deprivations: civil war, famine, disease. Leonid was only 3 years old when his mother died of typhus in 1920. He was too young to fully comprehend the loss, but it shaped the rest of his life. He and Yulia were raised by their grandmother, then brought into their father's new household when Nina Petrovna entered their lives. Unlike Yulia, Leonid struggled with Nina Petrovna. He was emotional, explosive, prone to pranks and mischief. Nina Petrovna was calm and conflict-averse. The two never formed the bond that Yulia had with her stepmother. As a young man, Leonid was attractive and charismatic. He enjoyed success with women and had a rebellious streak. His father, now a high-ranking party official, tried to impose discipline, but Leonid resisted. After finishing school, Leonid worked briefly as a mechanic at a factory. But when Khrushchev was transferred to Moscow in the mid-1930s, Leonid chose a different path. He enrolled in the Balashov School of Civil Aviation. This was a fateful decision. The Soviet military was expanding its air force, and young pilots were being rapidly trained. Leonid was drawn to flight, to the freedom and danger of the sky. Leonid became a cadet and then a pilot. He married a woman named Rosa Trevas, but the marriage was brief and ended in divorce. Khrushchev, who was by now deeply involved in Stalin's purges and rising through the party hierarchy, demanded that Leonid acknowledge a child born to another woman, Esther Ettinger. Family drama followed Leonid even as he trained for war. He later married Lyuba Khrushcheva, and they had a daughter named Yulia. But by the time their daughter was born, the world was already sliding toward another catastrophe. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Leonid was called into combat service. He became a senior lieutenant in the 18th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, flying combat missions over the Eastern Front. On March 11, 1943, Leonid's aircraft failed to return from a combat mission. He was listed as missing in action. No wreckage was found. No body was recovered. He simply vanished into the chaos of the Great Patriotic War. He was 25 years old. The circumstances of Leonid's disappearance spawned rumors. Some claimed he had been shot down. Others whispered that he had been captured by the Germans and executed on Stalin's orders after being recaptured, a punishment for supposed collaboration. These theories suggested that Khrushchev's later denunciation of Stalin was motivated by personal revenge. There is no credible evidence for these claims. Leonid's wingmate later stated that he saw the plane disintegrate but did not report it at the time, likely out of fear of being blamed for the death of a Politburo member's son. What is documented is the tragedy that followed. Leonid's wife Luba was arrested in Kuibyshev shortly after his disappearance. She was accused of espionage and sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. Her son, from a previous relationship, was placed in an orphanage. Leonid's daughter, also named Yulia, was raised by Nikita Khrushchev and Nina Petrovna as their own. Leonid's story ends here, unresolved. His fate remains uncertain. His family was shattered, and his memory was absorbed into the larger silence surrounding Soviet losses in World War II. Rada Khrushcheva was born on April 4, 1929, in Kiev. She was the first child of Nikita Khrushchev and Nina Petrovna to survive infancy. Before Rada, Nina had given birth to a daughter who died young. Rada's birth was a moment of joy for the family. Her name means joy or happiness in Ukrainian, a reflection of her parents' relief and delight. As a child, she was teased about her name in school, but it stuck. Rada grew up during the darkest years of Stalin's rule. Her father was party secretary in Moscow and then in Ukraine, deeply involved in the implementation of the Great Purges. Thousands were arrested, exiled, or executed under his watch. Rada's childhood was one of privilege shadowed by fear. The family lived in spacious apartments, enjoyed access to special stores, and moved in elite circles, but they also knew that favor could turn to denunciation overnight. She had two younger siblings, Sergey, born in 1935, and Elena, born in 1937. She also grew up alongside her older half-siblings, Yulia and Leonid, until Leonid's death in the war. Rada attended Moscow State University, where she studied biology. Her passion was not politics or journalism, but nature, animals, and the natural sciences. This was her refuge from the intensity of her family's political life. At university, she met Alexei Ivanovich Aljube, a journalism student who would become one of the most prominent Soviet journalists of his generation. After graduation, Rada did not pursue a career in biology research. Instead, she became an editor at Nauka i Жизнь, Science and Life, a popular science magazine. It was work that combined her love of biology with the world of publishing. This was a significant choice. She could have taken a high-profile political or cultural position, trading on her father's name. Instead, she chose editorial work that allowed her to stay engaged with science while remaining in the background. Rada married Alexei Aljube in the early 1950s. He was ambitious, talented, and politically astute. He had already begun to make a name for himself in Soviet journalism. They had three sons. The eldest, Nikita Sergeyevich Aljube, was named after Rada's father. Tragically, he died in 2007 at the age of 47 from a stroke. The marriage placed Rada at the intersection of family and power. Her husband was not just a journalist. He would become a key figure in her father's political circle. In 1957, Alexei was appointed editor-in-chief of Komsomolskaya Pravda, the newspaper of the Communist Youth League. He transformed it, introducing photographs, feature stories, and first-person accounts from ordinary citizens. Circulation nearly doubled. Then in 1959, he was appointed editor-in-chief of Izvestia, one of the two most important newspapers in the Soviet Union. This was a position of immense influence. Alexei became part of Khrushchev's inner circle, serving as an advisor, speechwriter, and informal diplomat. Rada, by extension, was now even closer to the center of power. Rada accompanied her father on his famous 1959 trip to the United States. She was photographed with the family at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, touring Hollywood studios and meeting American officials. In 1961, Alexei conducted an exclusive interview with President John F. Kennedy at the Kennedy family home in Hyannisport. It was the first time a Soviet journalist had been granted such access. The interview symbolized a brief thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations. But proximity to power was dangerous. Rada and Alexei lived well, but they also lived under scrutiny. Every word, every association, every decision was watched. In October 1964, Khrushchev was ousted in a coup orchestrated by Leonid Brezhnev and other Politburo members. He was removed from all positions and placed under KGB surveillance at his dacha outside Moscow. Alexei was immediately dismissed from Izvestia. His career was over. The couple's fortunes collapsed overnight. They lived quietly through the Brezhnev years. Khrushchev died in 1971. 1 week before his death, he visited Rada and Alexei, telling them, "Never regret that you lived in stormy times and worked with me in the Central Committee. We will yet be remembered." Alexei struggled with health problems in his later years. His memoirs were published in 1991. During the Glasnost period, he died in March 1993 at the age of 68. Rada outlived her husband by more than 2 decades. She continued to live in the spacious Moscow apartment where she had moved in 1956, just a short walk from Red Square. She worked as an editor at Nauka i Жизнь for nearly 50 years, maintaining her connection to science and nature even as the political world around her shifted. Rada died on August 11, 2016, in a Moscow hospital. She was 87 years old. Her funeral was private, attended only by close family. Her legacy is complex. She was the daughter who lived closest to power, yet she chose a life focused on science and editing rather than politics. She was married to one of the most influential journalists of the Khrushchev era, yet she remained in the background. And she outlived the Soviet Union itself, witnessing its collapse and the emergence of a new Russia. Sergey Khrushchev was born on July 2, 1935, in Moscow. He was the only son of Nikita Khrushchev and Nina Petrovna to survive to adulthood. His childhood coincided with his father's rise to the highest levels of the Soviet government. From his earliest years, Sergey lived in privilege. The family occupied large apartments, had access to special schools, and moved within the closed world of the Soviet elite. But privilege came with pressure. Sergey grew up under the shadow of Stalin in an atmosphere of fear and surveillance. Sergey was a teenager when World War II ended. He watched his father navigate the dangerous final years of Stalin's rule. Khrushchev was a member of the Politburo, deeply involved in the mechanics of Stalinist power. Sergey witnessed the contradictions of Soviet life, the propaganda of socialist equality alongside the reality of hierarchy and privilege. He saw his father order arrests and purges, then later denounce the very system he had helped build. Sergey did not follow his father into politics. Instead, he pursued engineering. He enrolled at the Moscow Power Engineering Institute, where he earned a master's degree with distinction. He later earned a doctoral degree from Bauman Moscow State Technical University and a PhD from the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. His field was missile and spacecraft design. He worked at the Vladimir Chelomey Rocket Design Bureau, contributing to the development of ballistic missiles and spacecraft during the height of the Cold War space race. He received numerous awards, including the Medal of the Labor Hero, the Order of Lenin, the Lenin Prize, and the Prize of the Soviet Union's Council of Ministers. He was, by any measure, a successful Soviet engineer. In 1959, Sergey accompanied his father on the historic trip to the United States. He toured American cities, visited farms and factories, and witnessed the strange spectacle of his father, a peasant's son, being treated as a head of state. Sergey was in his 20s during his father's tenure as Soviet leader. He saw the reforms, the thaw in cultural policy, the denunciation of Stalin. He also saw the missteps, the agricultural failures, the erratic foreign policy, the growing resentment within the party. Their relationship was close but complex. Sergey admired his father's courage in challenging Stalin's legacy, but he also understood the costs. On October 13, 1964, Khrushchev was summoned back from vacation and confronted by the Presidium of the Central Committee. He was accused of mishandling the Cuban Missile Crisis, damaging relations with China, and disorganizing the Soviet economy. He was voted out of power. Sergey witnessed his father's humiliation. Khrushchev was stripped of his positions, placed under KGB surveillance, and forbidden from participating in public life. He spent the last 7 years of his life at his dacha, writing his memoirs in secret. Sergey continued his engineering work, but the fall had marked him. He understood that power in the Soviet system was fragile and that loyalty was no guarantee of security. Khrushchev died in 1971. The Soviet government refused to grant him a state funeral. He was buried at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, a place reserved for prominent cultural figures but not for disgraced politicians. Sergey spent the next 2 decades working and writing. He began to compile and edit his father's memoirs, translating them and preparing them for publication. This work became his mission, to preserve and explain his father's legacy. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Sergey faced a choice. In 1991, Sergey moved to the United States with his wife, Valentina. He accepted a position at Brown University's Center for Foreign Policy Development in Providence, Rhode Island, where he would teach courses on the Cold War, Soviet history, and international relations. He was 56 years old. The move was not a defection. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union no longer existed. Sergey saw himself as a scholar, not an exile. On July 12, 1999, Sergey and Valentina became naturalized U.S. citizens. At the ceremony, Sergey said, "I'm feeling like a newborn. It's the beginning of a new life. This is a great country, and it's an honor to live here." He retained his Russian citizenship, becoming a dual citizen. He waited more than the required 5 years before seeking citizenship, fearing it would restrict his ability to visit his extended family in Moscow. His 3 sons and 3 grandchildren still lived in Russia. At Brown University, Sergey taught courses on the post-Soviet states, the Cold War, and Russian foreign policy. He was known for his deep knowledge of Soviet infrastructure, politics, and personalities. He spoke with wry humor about Ukrainian politics, Cuban socialism, and the intricacies of gas pipelines. He also served as a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies and held an occasional professorship at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He wrote extensively. His books include Khrushchev on Khrushchev, an inside account of the man and his era, Nikita Khrushchev and the Creation of a Superpower, and Memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, Reformer. These works provided invaluable insights into Soviet decision-making and the personality of his father. Sergey did not become a typical Soviet émigré who denounced the USSR to gain favor in the West. He presented a nuanced view, critical of both Soviet and American policies. He loved the United States, but did not hate Russia. He maintained this balance throughout his life. On June 18, 2020, Sergey Khrushchev died at his home in Cranston, Rhode Island. He was 84 years old. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head, ruled a suicide by the Rhode Island Medical Examiner's Office. There were no signs of foul play. The news was met with shock by his colleagues and students. His wife, Valentina, told Russian media that he died of old age, but official reports confirmed the manner of death. Sergey's funeral was held in Moscow in October 2020, bringing him full circle back to the city where he was born. His legacy is profound. He was the primary translator of his father's story to the English-speaking world. He provided context, documents, and personal memories that shaped how historians understand Khrushchev's era. And he did so with integrity, refusing to simplify or distort the record for political purposes. Sergey Khrushchev was the child who became the guardian of his father's memory. Elena Khrushcheva was born in 1937, the youngest child of Nikita Khrushchev and Nina Petrovna. She was born during the height of Stalin's purges, when her father was party secretary in Ukraine, overseeing the arrest and execution of thousands. Her birth name was Elena, but she was known to her family as Lena. Elena grew up in the same privileged but tense environment as her siblings. She attended elite schools, lived in government apartments, and was shielded from the worst deprivations of Soviet life. But she was also a child of the war years. When Germany invaded in 1941, the family was evacuated to Kuibyshev, far from the fighting. She was only 4 years old, too young to fully understand the chaos around her. After the war, the family returned to Moscow. Elena continued her education, eventually enrolling at Moscow State University. Elena studied law. It was a practical field, one that offered career stability without requiring her to enter the political arena. She later worked at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, a prestigious research institution. She married, though little is publicly known about her husband or her domestic life. She remained private, avoiding the visibility that had marked her sister Rada's life. From childhood, Elena suffered from systemic lupus erythematosus, a chronic autoimmune disease. In the 1960s and 1970s, treatment for lupus was limited. The disease could attack multiple organ systems, causing pain, fatigue, and life-threatening complications. Elena fought her illness with determination, but it steadily weakened her. She continued to work and maintain her family life, but the disease took its toll. Elena Khrushcheva died in 1972, 1 year after her father's death. She was only 35 years old. Her death was quiet, noted only within the family and close circles. There was no public announcement, no state recognition, She simply slipped away. Her passing added another layer of grief to a family already marked by loss and political disgrace. Khrushchev had died the year before, denied a state funeral, and buried in a cemetery for artists and intellectuals rather than among Soviet leaders. Elena's death so soon after seemed almost cruelly timed. She left behind a legacy of privacy. Unlike her siblings, whose lives intersected with history in visible ways, Elena lived and died in the background. Her struggles were personal, her achievements unrecorded, her suffering largely unknown. Power does not guarantee visibility, it does not ensure longevity, and it offers no protection against illness, loss, or the ordinary tragedies of life. Nikita Khrushchev ruled the Soviet Union at the height of its power. He commanded nuclear arsenals, directed global policy, and shaped the course of the Cold War. Yet his children lived lives defined not by their proximity to power, but by their attempts to navigate it, escape it, or survive it. Yulia chose science and obscurity. Leonid disappeared into war. Rada lived closest to the center, then watched it collapse. Sergey emigrated, becoming the interpreter of his father's legacy. Elena fought her illness in silence. Each life was different. Each ended differently. But together they tell a story that history often overlooks. The personal cost of political power and the very human lives lived in the shadow of a giant. This is what happened to Nikita Khrushchev's children.